Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second lecture, our second content lecture of Introduction to Classical Mythology. Today, we're going to be talking about classical reception, and that is a category of essentially literary theory and analytical theory. And by theory, I mean a framework that we can use to analyze specific texts and stories and understandings. So we're going to talk today about those larger frameworks and how we can apply them practically. This is possibly the most conceptually complex of the content lectures. So if you are finding yourself a little bit lost or needing to listen a couple of times or what have you, you're not alone. It is a heavier lecture, and not all of my lectures will be like this, so don't feel too worried about the course in general. So our directions for today are classical reception theory. We have to begin by talking about what actually is classical reception. I keep saying that. What does that mean? Talk about the history of classical reception as a discipline, as well as the theories, the frameworks, and the terminology associated with it. And then we will do a little case study. And by case study, I just mean an example. We're going to apply the theories we learn about to a specific text, the Hunger Games. We will talk a bit in brief about the myth of Theseus, and in passing, that will possibly necessitate a mention of his father's suicide. So just a content warning there. So let us begin by laying out the actual theory itself. This is one of the coolest things about classics, I think. This is one of the things that keeps students coming back, and a lot of times when you ask somebody, why are you in this class? Why are you interested in myth? Their response is, well, I heard about it when I played the video game Hades, or when I watched the movie 300, or whatever. Usually media is the first interaction that students and that people in general, the general public, have with classics as a discipline. So classical reception can be defined as the study of how classical culture, especially ancient Greek and Latin literature, has been received in the post-classical world. Received is a weird word to use there, right? Received, almost like you receive a gift, right? So when I say received in this context, I mean the way that people have picked up the ancient stories, picked up the history and the literature and the myths, picked them up and started to rework them to suit their own interests and like social political contexts. So that is another term that is a useful one to know. Reception is the way that a work is understood, interpreted, talked about, and reapplied by its readers. And that can be media, so video games or movies or any form of media, TikTok videos, or scholarship, so the way that people who study classics talk about classics and the trends that have taken place. Classical reception is therefore the study of the representation of the ancient world, of classical antiquity, as we discussed in the last lecture. The study of the representation of the ancient world from ancient to modern times. So the way that people have done classical antiquity, have passed classical antiquity on after the classical period ended. A work can be received as soon as it's created. Oftentimes you'll hear that a movie was received well by critics. People reviewed it well. They thought that they did a good job. And this in classics happened all the time. Aeschylus wrote a play in the 5th century BCE called Agamemnon, and that's part of the reception of Homer's Iliad, which was composed in the around the 8th century BCE. So several hundred years later for them, and then even Aeschylus is very ancient for us. But when we talk about classical reception in the context of doing classical scholarship, we're usually talking about post-classical readers and writers. So what people were doing with classics after classics was over. So in that case, I would be thinking about, for example, Dante, or Shakespeare, or all the way up to modern times, the examples I've already given. So why does that matter? This is kind of one of my favorite lecture formats, is like, what is this, and then why do we care? Because there's no need to be studying things that we don't think are engaging and interesting, and I do really think that this is one of the most important things about classics. So why does classical reception happen? The first, and probably what we owe most of the popularity of classical myths to, is that modern retellings make ancient myths more accessible. As you will see when we begin doing some of the original readings, they can be very complex. They are written in a completely different time period using a set of references that we don't always even have access to as scholars, let alone as people in the general public. But those myths, when they are put into a young adult novel or a movie, they can be parsed in a way that makes sense for the modern experience. So it's a way of passing down myths that encapsulate generalities about the human experience. Classical myth focuses on the most extreme bests and worsts of humanity and give us blueprints for how to navigate the world. And it also, as I mentioned in the last lecture as well, tells us what values are important enough to pass down to the next generation. And this gives us kind of, classical reception gives us a way of doing that. And we can use new media to rework the original myth. A lot of times you'll see people complaining, essentially, about texts, new media that get the story wrong. So one thing you'll find out in this class is that the protagonist of the video game Hades, Zagreus, is not actually, like, that's not a real person as such, not in the way that they've done in the game. But, like, that's super okay, and it's interesting. We can make those stories more applicable to the modern world, and we can shift them around to better reflect our values. And that tells us stuff about us, which is cool. I think that's interesting. So it isn't all about accuracy as such. It also makes storytelling more efficient. When we have these kind of cultural giants that we can refer to, it gives us kind of like a shortcut for how to describe something. So we could say, oh, he's a Hercules, or this is a Trojan horse. And because we have this shared basis of cultural knowledge, that means something. And I don't have to go into any more depth about what I mean when I say this guy's a Hercules. It also gives new stories and the values that they intend to pass down a sense of a cultural authority as part of a long tradition. If it is using classics, it feels a little bit more serious. It's tapping into this big history that has persisted throughout many generations. And we can also reuse bigger ideas from the classical world, not just individual stories. So we can take a formula that works. We'll talk in the lecture, like 5 or something, about the hero's journey. But there's also other things like oral storytelling, or all sorts of things, where we can take that formula and copy it or play around with it to resist expectations. The quote-unquote perfect tragic structure, for example, is one thing that gets picked up and reworked all the time. And then this is also extremely, getting rid of my little picture-in-picture situation. Talking about mythology gives us critical distance from the modern world. This is another bolded term, therefore an important term, critical distance. Critical distance is when we are shown a world that is not quite our own, but it's close enough that we can automatically start making connections. We're thinking about our world when we're watching the other world. And things happen in that world, but because it's distant from us, we're able to judge it without feeling like that's coming back and attacking us. We can make critical, and that doesn't mean negative, it means unbiased, analytical judgments about what is happening and why it happened, what led to it. And that means that we can process those lessons at a safe distance, a critical distance, and then apply them to our own world later. It's also a way of avoiding censorship, because I'm not really telling a story about the political situation right now. I'm telling a story about classics, but the similarities encourage the audience to make a connection. There's another term for this process that's usually used in science fiction, but just in case you're familiar with this term, cognitive estrangement, it's the same idea. Don't worry about that term, though. That's not, when I'm referring to this, I will use the term critical distance. So that is what classical reception is and why it matters. It's prolific. It is an important way that classics manifests in our world. And now I want to talk about how we got here. How did we, as scholars, understand how to do classical reception, how to study reception pieces. So today's reading involved the theory of a scholar named Jauss. And Jauss divides classical reception and the history of classical reception into two different stages. So when people first started doing classical reception, in the Renaissance to the early modern period. The Renaissance was called such because it was the rebirth of the classical era. So it was brought into the modern, at the time, the contemporary world, and moved forward. So that's kind of where Jauss anyways starts his clock. So in that period, they judged contemporary literature against the standards of the ancients. So Aristotle tells us what the perfect tragedy looks like. Shakespeare writes a tragedy, and then I tell Shakespeare that he's very good because he followed the ancient structure, or he's very bad because he didn't. Then the Enlightenment comes along. And the Enlightenment is all about human ingenuity, human ability. And they, at that point, traced the influence of ancient texts on contemporary national canons. So they looked at, for example, Shakespeare, and they were like, I can see how classics influenced this text and made it as good as it is. And because humans are so amazing and the ancients were so amazing, we have inherited this legacy. Then after World War I, people were there's a period known as modernism, where there was kind of a break from people wanting to rely on tradition, because people had relied on tradition for a very long time and it caused a lot of human suffering. And so after World War I, modern literary texts were kind of understood as being autonomous, complete in themselves. I don't need to pay any attention to any text that came before it. It just exists on its own. And once we hit the 1960s, things kind of found a more comfortable middle ground, and this is known as the true reception studies, so the way that we do classical reception now. But of course, every one of these eras has felt that their model of doing classical reception studies was the correct one, so take it with a grain of salt. But what we do now is, our understanding is that the modern text is valuable in itself, and it's also interesting and useful to look at the historical dialogues it's participating in. So I'm not going to go and criticize the Disney movie Hercules for being inaccurate. It's an interesting text in itself. It's doing stuff by itself, but it is participating in a larger historical dialogue that is worth noting and discussing. So here's more on the classical tradition model. So the old-fashioned way of looking at reception pieces that we don't do anymore, or at least we have kind of come to an agreement as scholars, is limiting. So the classical tradition model is defined as the study of the transmission and dissemination of classical culture through the ages, usually with an emphasis on the influence of classical writers, artists, and thinkers on subsequent intellectual movements and individual works. So we see here the influence of classical writers on modern works. What the value of the modern work lies in its ability to be a window into the ancient world. It bolsters the power of the ancient writers rather than being valuable as a text in itself. And so it appreciates the legacy of ancient cultures. Legacy is a word that is associated with the classical tradition model. And the way that we best do classical tradition study is that we get a formal education. You go to school and you become a classicist and you learn Latin and you learn ancient Greek, and you can go back and retrieve an inherent meaning that just exists from the dead and static ancient world, and then apply it directly to new text. So you can look back at what happened in the ancient world. You can say, yes, true wisdom, and I'm able to access this wisdom because I was able to afford to get a classical education, and then I can turn around and apply it to Disney's Hercules and say, oh, poo-poo, this is not accurate. So we can see maybe from my tone that there's a little bit of sarcasm there, right? It was not necessarily the most fair to new texts, and it privileged classical education, which was a mark of the upper class. Another quote about the classical tradition model, in it, the Greco-Roman antiquity, so classical antiquity, provides the foundation for and influences the development of modern Europe and Western civilization. So if you know classics, if you know Latin, you know Greek, etc., you are able to access the foundation of civilization as a whole. And therefore, if you follow that train of logic just a little bit further, people who are derive from the European tradition, people who are born into that legacy as such, somehow have more access to civilization, which is, of course, problematic. This model assumes stable meaning. It assumes that the ancients wrote their texts and that's what they mean. That's it. There's nothing else that can be talked about or done with it. It favors canon and hierarchies. So this ancient text is better than that ancient text because it's the one that's been studied. It's the one that has a legacy with it, as well as modern hierarchies. So high literature is more interesting than popular literature, because it has a more obvious connection to the ancient world, for example. And the classical canon is viewed as timeless or exemplary or universally good. It is real, true quality. And if we could just go back to the way that things were written then, wouldn't everything be wonderful? It also is only interested in continuity. It's only interested in the way that we are the same as the ancients. It skims over differences. And therefore it downplays historical and cultural context, because when we're not thinking about the differences, in addition to the similarities, we are not appreciating that we do live in a very different time than the ancients. It is teleological. It's very end-based. Humanity is on a roller coaster that only goes up. And it talks about influence. So influence, legacy, canon, hierarchies, these are all associated with classical tradition. And it is trying to seek out and appreciate the true source of Western literature and culture, aka classics. So as I've been not even hinting at, as I've been harping on perhaps, as we go through that, there are a lot of problems with that model. It's based on an extremely narrow set of perspectives: Anglo-Eurocentric, colonial, and aristocratic. It undervalues diversity. It wants everything to be the same. And it also assumes that classical myths and classical thinkers teach unproblematic lessons that we can just pick up and apply to any context. So they were just wise, and we do best to learn from their lessons. If you know much at all about classical history, this is very much not the case. So that's something to keep in mind. It also asserts that only art that requires higher education, specifically a classical education, to understand is valuable. Art that continues the classical tradition is art that must be interpreted with a university degree as such. And it ignores and discourages art's role in engaging with and contributing to social change. It dismisses social change. It's only interested in social continuity. So because this is a problematic model, in the 1960s, we've replaced it. People still do it. People definitely, don't get me wrong, like, it happens, but it is kind of accepted as an old-fashioned way of doing things. And so now we have the true classical reception model, aka the model that we use right now. But again, true is relative. So here's another quote. According to the classical reception model, individuals and societies continually reappropriate and redefine classical antiquity in an effort to assert or at times to challenge continuity with a privileged past. In other words, people pick up old stories and rework them for new purposes that are more relevant for them in their lives. And both the original story and the new story are important. From the Hardwick reading, reception studies are concerned not only with individual texts and their relationship with one another, but also with the broader cultural processes which shape and make up those relationships. So we're interested not just in this text is redoing this other text. We're interested in the big picture. Why did this text look the way that it did? So it asserts unstable meaning. The meaning of a text can change over time based on how people are interpreting it. It questions canons and hierarchies and values diversity in both the ancient and the modern world. So we are interested in popular culture because it is a representation of today's world too. It highlights differences and uses those differences to better understand both the ancient world and the modern world. And so it's emphasizing contexts, both ancient contexts and modern ones. It speaks of appropriation and dialogue. So not legacy, not tradition, but appropriation, dialogue, a two-way street. They're going back and forth. But the ancient and the modern world. So what we've covered so far is what is classical reception as both a thing, like how do we do classical reception, and then as scholarship, as how do we interpret a classical reception piece. And so now let's talk about how to actually, like how you and I would go about analyzing a piece of classical reception. So we hear that there's a new Odyssey movie coming out. And we think to ourselves, oh boy, okay, let's do some classical reception analysis of this. How do we do it? The first thing we have to decide, that's probably a bad example simply because it hasn't come out yet, and thus I cannot actually use it. But let's say Disney has Hercules. So we can start by, there's two different approaches we can take. So we can start by deciding which one we want to take. The first one is the classics in approach. Classics in movies, classics in media, etc. And to do that, we ask ourselves, what specific myth is the piece of modern media reworking? In Disney's Hercules, it's the myth of Hercules. What parts of the myth does it keep and what parts does it do away with? So in that movie, Hercules is super strong, he's a hero, he does cool things, but it does away with some of the darker themes. The protagonist, or the female protagonist, for example, has the same name as the woman that he ends up in the myth killing. So, it kind of gets rid of some of those more nasty bits. And then we ask ourselves, well, why? Why would it change that? The easy answer for Disney is that Disney, it's a kid's movie. And so the audience is different, and also Disney doesn't want to get itself wrapped up into difficult, complex depictions oftentimes. So it sanitizes it. That's a classics in approach. Classics and approach is when you think about classics and media. How are classical ideas about how to write stories used in the modern world? At that point, I would take Disney's Hercules and I would say, okay, how are classical ideas about how to write heroes, how to create heroes, reused in Disney's Hercules? How does it line up with the ancient way of doing things? What similar themes and ideas and story patterns and stylistic features are reused, and what ones aren't, and why. Modern media, as we've come to at this point, modern media is always in dialogue with stories that have come before. So even if it isn't overtly classics, like you see Disney's Hercules and you're like, okay, that's about the myth of Hercules. That's, it's not hiding it. But all media is in its own context, is in dialogue with stories that have come before. And one of the big sources of stories that have come before is classical antiquity. And so we can think about classical reception for any piece of media. And to study the dialogue between a piece of media and the stories that have come before, we can use a set of tools, a toolkit, called the aesthetics of reception. Now, of course, aesthetics of reception, that's a very highfalutin sounding term. It's just a way of approaching a piece of modern media in order to explore how it interacts with what's come before. And that same scholar that delineated the different periods of classical reception, Jauss, he's the one who talks about the aesthetics of reception. So basically, to break it down, Jauss says that every text has a historical context and a social purpose, no matter what you're doing. And when I say text, I should also mention, I mean that very, very broadly. A TikTok video is a text. I don't mean literally like something written down on paper. I mean a piece of content. I guess we say content these days, don't we? Content creators and such. But so every piece of content has a historical context. A TikTok released in 2020 has a whole bunch of stuff going on that's different from a TikTok released in 2025, or I guess there wasn't TikTok before then, so I can't say in like 2005, but a piece of maybe a vlog from 2005. They have different historical contexts, and they have specific social purposes. They are created for a reason, to do something. The historical context and social purpose of both the original story and the reception piece, the new story, they are both important, and we can compare them. So if we're picking up Disney's Hercules, Disney's Hercules was, I think it was in the 90s. We can look at the historical context of the 90s and compare it to the historical context of the ancient world, and see what's different and what's interesting there, as well as the social purpose. When I explained on the last slide why Disney's Hercules is a little bit more sanitized, the answer was, well, it's Disney. It's a kids film. It's not designed to be a certain way. That's a social purpose. It is designed to entertain children, which is a different thing than the original Hercules myth was trying to do. Every reader, in turn, has a horizon of expectation. There's a whole bunch of these like terms, right? But when we break them down, they're not they do kind of make sense. So every reader has a horizon of expectation, and what that means is every reader brings context to a text. They have a lifetime of experience that influences what they expect out of a story. You don't go into a Disney film expecting there to be a big bloodbath, right? Because that doesn't feel like Disney. And if they did do that, you would walk out saying, "Whoa, what's going on at Disney HQ these days?" And that horizon of expectation shapes how you engage with the text. You might come out of that Disney film feeling really uneasy, feeling like it was a uncomfortable movie, making you judge it differently. And also, it also works positively. When everybody lives happily ever after at the end of the Disney movie, it feels satisfying because that's what you expect from Disney. And so we can thus talk about how changing horizons of expectation, the changing contexts, historical and social contexts, that shape these individuals, those changing horizons of expectation affect how we retell myth. The producers of the Disney movie aren't going to make something that isn't expected from a Disney movie. So it's all a big circle. Another scholar named Gadamer added to this toolkit. So Jauss put out this toolkit. He was like, "Okay, guys, this is how we're going to do classical reception." And people were like, "Yeah, no, I feel you." And then Gadamer was like, "Here, one more thing." He says it's important that we pay attention to the fact that meaning is not essential to any story. Sometimes when we use the word essential, we mean important. It is essential that you read your readings to get the most out of the course, whatever. But that's not what it means here. Essential in this sense means inherent, baked in, part of the DNA. So what he means is that there is no inherent, static, universally true, inside the story meaning that is waiting in ancient myths to be correctly identified by someone with a classical education and drawn out to enlighten people. That's not how it works. Meaning is constructed by the people who engage with the story. And every time people retell the story, the meaning of the story is added to and changed. When you think of Hercules, you're thinking of not just the Hercules in the ancient texts we're going to read, because most of you probably haven't read those ancient texts, right? And that's not a criticism. That's just not how you've heard of Hercules. So if I told you some crazy thing about Hercules, which maybe I will, something not expected, you're going to be like, "Whoa, that's not but that's because the myth of Hercules is more than just what the ancients said. It's this whole compilation of Hercules as he's been retold throughout history. And therefore, there is no good or bad or right or wrong when we do reception. Each version is meaningful because it is engaging with the original myth and doing something. So this is when you do, for example, create a reception project, when you you yourself decide to take on this mantle. Same thing. There's no good or bad. It's just what it is. And the meaning of a myth can change over time based on the horizon of expectation that each reader is working with, as well as the previous receptions that the story has had before, which produce layers of meaning. And we've talked about that a bit now. Therefore, when we use the classical reception model, we start by comparing the myth with a piece of media. So we take the media, and then we say, okay, where's the myth? Where do we get the classics in it? We compare the historical contexts, so the time and place it was written, as well as the social purposes, what those texts were intended to do, of the reception, the modern thing, and the ancient thing. And we compare them to find an explanation for why the myth is different from this piece of media and why it's the same. We can then draw meaning from the reception piece based on how it uses the original myth. And then we can turn around and go backwards and apply what we learned from the reception piece, from the modern piece, to the original myth, and possibly have a window into something new in the original myth that we hadn't thought of before. And why would we do all of those things? Why? That's a lot of things to do. Why? As we've talked about, every piece of reception influences our understanding of the original myth. So it's important that we recognize what's happening. It's in order to really like appreciate that compounded meaning of the original myth, you kind of have to be tracking it. And reception is also how most of modern society engages with myth. This is how most people do classics. Most people will not take a myth course. And so this is their access to the ancient world. And so knowing about how the public is engaging with myth is valuable for a classicist. Reception practice also reveals the similarities and differences between ancient and modern culture. It brings them to the forefront. And it breaks down this idea that either classical ideas and values are just universally good, universally true, but it also breaks down the idea that the classical world is remote or alien. It's neither of those things. It is a complex source of ideas and things to think with. We can then use reception to track the changing of horizons of expectation, and watch how cultures are changing in real time. So I can go back in history and look at all the different interpretations of Hercules and see how they're changing and get a window into how humans have changed over time through that. And being aware of how classics is being used for different social purposes helps us stay aware of what's going on in our world socially, and politically, and etc. So that's the hard stuff. That's the theory. That's the convoluted terms and so on. What I want to do now is a case study. So we're going to practice applying classical reception to a piece of modern media, just to see how it's done. So I'm going to do the Hunger Games. I'm glad that they keep releasing Hunger Games movies, so I don't have to come up with a new one of case study to go through. It's Hunger. It's getting old. But in any case, in order to talk about the classical reception of the Hunger Games, I do have to give you a quick and dirty what is the myth of Theseus, because we're going to be talking about the myth of Theseus. This is not your introduction to the myth of Theseus. Don't worry about memorizing any of this. I will go into much more detail about Theseus in the Heroes lecture. Right now, you just need a little bit of context to understand what I'm saying. So, myth of Theseus. There was a city-state called Athens. It waged war on a small island called Crete. They fought each other. Athens lost. And so as punishment, Crete's king Minos ordered that Athens would send them 14 tributes each year to be eaten by his pet Minotaur. And we'll learn more about how he got a pet Minotaur later, but that's what's relevant right now. He's got a monster pet. Theseus, who is a demigod and the son of the king of Athens, he volunteers as tribute. He goes to Crete. He is sent into the labyrinth where the Minotaur is kept, and he fights him. To ensure that he gets back out again, the princess of Crete, Ariadne, who finds him attractive and wants to make sure that he gets out alive so that they can live happily ever after together, she gives him a ball of string. She holds onto one end, he unravels the ball of string as he walks, and then he's able, once he's killed the Minotaur, to turn around and follow the string back out. Clever, clever. He slays the Minotaur, and he takes Ariadne as his wife, and they all live happily ever after, except that they don't, because when on the trip back home, Theseus just forgets Ariadne on a beach somewhere, and he ends up causing the suicide of his father. Again, very quick overview. We will talk about all of those things in a lot more detail later, but that's what happens. Theseus appears in the Hunger Games. The author has confirmed that this is intentional, that this was there on purpose. That does not have to be the case. Just because something isn't intentional doesn't mean it isn't there, and doesn't mean it can't be read in. And part of that is because these stories influence culture so deeply. They're being retold again and again and again everywhere. So you can be influenced by classics without even realizing. But Suzanne Collins did, in fact, know she was doing it. So she said it. So I'm not just telling you fake news here. In the Hunger Games, districts, the world is divided into districts. They rise up and they try to overcome the capital. So this is similar to Athens rising up against Crete. And then to reaffirm their power, the capital orders 24 tributes to be sent every year to participate in a reality television show where they murder each other and fight human-animal hybrids. We're already seeing some familiar bits and pieces, tributes, the reaffirming political power, punishing an uprising through this tribute system. Katniss Everdeen, the Theseus of this story, volunteers as tribute, just as Theseus did. She goes to the Hunger Games and she competes, and she slays the human-animal hybrids, and she wins. She wins alongside PETA, but in any case, she teams up with a man from her district to ensure that they're both able to survive, and she breaks the rules of the game in order to keep them both alive. Just like Ariadne breaks the rules of the game by allowing Theseus to get out of the labyrinth successfully. She then gets into a public-facing relationship with PETA, but then instead of forgetting PETA on a beach and having her parent commit suicide or something, she actually ends up starting a revolution, and she is able to bring down the immoral regime. So we can see there are a lot of similarities. It helps that the author has said, yes, I am purposely using Theseus, so I don't have to necessarily prove that it was intentional or anything like that, prove that it's there. But even without that confirmation, we can see the similarities. We can see, okay, Theseus is definitely here, but there are some differences. Regardless, that's the first step. The first step is seeing what's the same and what's different. The second step is to talk about the historical context and the social purposes of the two texts, and to see if we can find an explanation for why things are similar and why things are different. We already know a lot about the historical context of the Hunger Games, of course, because it's our context, but Theseus is a hero in the ancient world, closely associated with Athens, and he is sent to a foreign city to face a barbaric beast and render his city safe. So it's a different thing than Katniss, who is a member of an oppressed faction of society rising up against the faction in power. Athens was actually head of something called the Delian League in the 5th century, and they were tasked with protecting their allies from the foreign threat of Persia. And so this story of Theseus was actually used to promote the Delian League, to promote the people in power by politicians. In real life, not in the story, in real life, Athens was the one demanding tribute from their cities. They didn't have a pet minotaur, I'm afraid, but they got money and stuff. They were the head of their power structure, and the myth of Theseus was used to keep it that way. Katniss, on the other hand, is sent to defeat beasts and people from other downtrodden districts in order to save her sister. And she eventually brings down the power structure of the world she's living in. So unlike Theseus, who is set to reaffirm him. Collins is writing in a modern American context and comparing the world of the Capitol to the world of reality TV and Hollywood, and the desensitization of our world to violence. It also heavily discusses the injustice of a class system where the rich and powerful are exerting control over all of society. So she's Katniss, although Katniss is clearly Theseus from the similarities we were able to draw out, she's doing something very different. She's going against the rich and powerful instead of promoting them and trying to keep the power structure the way it is. Therefore, the key differences between Theseus and Katniss create meaning. Once we've established that they are similar in a lot of ways, we can look at those differences to understand what's different about today's time. So both Theseus and Katniss volunteer as tributes and they commit heroic acts, but Theseus is a tribute for a foreign state and reaffirms the power of his own state, while Katniss is a tribute for her own state and she ends up bringing the regime down. They both fight against monsters, but Theseus fights off stage against an evil Minotaur in the darkness of the labyrinth, and the act of killing that Minotaur makes him a hero. Whereas Katniss fights against other tributes on live TV for the rich people of society, and it's the act of killing that is evil. It doesn't make her evil necessarily because you understand what she's doing, but the fact she's being forced to do it is what's considered morally corrupt there. They both use a romantic partner to break the rules of the game, but Theseus forgets about Ariadne once her plot relevance has ended, whereas Katniss's relationship with Peeta ends up becoming a way for them to continue to manipulate the political situation, because Theseus's political situation was the way he wanted it to be, whereas Katniss's wasn't. And this is important and interesting because it goes outside of the text. It goes past the text. The text has used the myth of Theseus in a new historical context to fight against power and wealth instead of reaffirming it. And we can look back at the myth of Theseus. We can take that understanding and realize the backwardsness of the way that it was used to promote the Delian League. And then we can see when the Hunger Games is used in new context and how Theseus underlies that. So this was during the Ferguson riots. If we burn, you burn with us was painted onto a classical looking building, which is a quote from the Hunger Games. And so when we are using the Hunger Games in these contexts, we've got Theseus in the background. He's there. And therefore, the next time the story of Theseus gets picked up and reworked, whatever that new interpretation is going to have to deal with the fact that our Theseus is a girl who fights against the rich and wealthy instead of fighting for them, as illustrated by the fact that those quotes are being used in modern political situations that deal with injustice in society. That was a lot. So it's okay if there were bits that you want to go over. It's a heavy lecture, but again, don't let it scare you. Most of our other lectures are going to be chatting about stories. So, to summarize, classical reception is the study of how classical culture, including myth, is received in the post-classical world. It's retelling authoritative ancient stories in a new and more applicable way that allows us critical distance from the modern world. At first, they used the classical tradition model, which was all about continuity and canon and influence and inheritance and legacy. But now we like to use the classical reception model. There are two ways we can apply it: the classics in model, the classics and model. But either way, those models focus on studying new versions of old stories as a way to tell us about both the new and the old stories, as well as the cultural context of each. Both stories are valuable. It isn't just about one copying the other. A scholar named Jauss told us that there is a dialogue taking place between the producer of the text and the recipient of the text, and that dialogue is influenced by the different horizons of expectations, which is just another way to say what they're expecting based on their personal cultural background. We can study this dialogue using a toolkit called the Aesthetics of Reception. Another scholar named Gadamer has told us that meaning is not essential, and by essential he means inherent, in a myth. Each new retelling changes the myth's meaning. And a step-by-step guide for how to do classical reception. First, we compare the stories themselves, looking for similarities and differences. We compare their historical contexts and their social purposes, looking for an explanation of those differences. We draw meaning about our world from the reception piece, and then we apply the lessons we learned to the original myth to look for new meanings. Next week, we're going to talk about Hesiod. But Hesiod is another, we're starting with Hesiod because it's old, and we also want to start with like the origins, like the creation or whatever of the world mythologically, which kind of necessitates starting with Hesiod. But he is weird to read if you've never read classical stuff before. So keep in mind when you read it that it is a 2,800-year-old poem that is missing parts. So it's weird. It's okay that it's weird. You're not bad at reading things. It is just weird. It is full of strange people and places and ideas and names. You might feel alienated, uncomfortable. It is totally normal. Don't be like, oh my god, I won't be able to read anything in this class. No, that's not how it works. You'll be all right. So first, just read it. Just don't worry. Don't memorize a bunch of names or anything like that. Just try to find the story in it. There is one. Even if there's a lot of, this guy was the son of that guy and the son of that guy. And then read it again, probably after lecture, and make notes, sketching out the main plot summary. What's the story? What's it about? How is it structured? Pay attention to the major characters, the recurring characters, as well as the ones that I discussed in lecture. Think about what is strange in it and why those things are strange. Usually in the places where, whenever you're doing text analysis, the places where the story is a little bit weird catches your attention and you're like, wait a sec, that doesn't make sense. That's usually where the story is getting interesting. That's usually where there's something to pick at in terms of finding something to, like, finding analysis. And then I want you to think about how it responds to some of the essential questions of human existence. Like what is it? Why is it here? What is its purpose? And of course, listen to the lecture and we'll go from there. All right. Thank you everybody for listening, and I will see you in lecture 3.